Hey guys, in this video we're going to translate chapter 12 of the Ecce Romani textbook. So like we always say, before you do anything, you want to make sure that you've got the vocab under control, that you've read through the grammar notes to make sure that you understand what's going on. In this chapter, it's really doing a review of the ablative case, so make sure you've read it, so that way when you see the ablative case in the story, you'll be able to recognize it and translate it. The last thing you want to do is always make sure that you're reading this story out loud. So find a partner, someone that you can read to in class or maybe at home, wherever, that you can read the story out loud to, and then have them read the story back to you so you can practice your listening and your speaking. Once you have all those set, you should feel pretty good about your translation with this story. So before we dive in, we want to do a quick bit of grammar review. Like I said, the ablative case is what this chapter is reviewing. So you want to step back and just make sure that you understand it. We've seen a lot of different uses so far in the first 12 chapters, but you want to just make sure that you feel pretty comfortable with it. And if you want a full review, feel free to read either the notes in your textbook, or you could take a look at my chapter 12 grammar video that I've linked at the end of this video. But you want to remember that a Latin noun, right, you look at the ending, and the ending will tell you what that noun is doing in the sentence. So for instance, whether it's a subject or a direct object, or maybe with a preposition or showing possession, whatever the case may be. So in this chapter, we're coming back to the ablative case. And like I said, we've seen it a few times before. So you want to remember that the first time we saw it, it was introduced with prepositional phrases, right? So we said that if you have a prepositional phrase and it's a preposition with an ablative case noun, then it's often showing position or location. So for instance, you might be under a tree or in a house, something like that. Or it could be showing motion out of or away from something, right? So if you're going out of the house, you'd say a we la with a long A, right? Ablative case. On its own, though, we've seen a bunch of different uses of the ablative. One of them that we see really often is time. So phrases like brevi tempore, in a short time. But there's a bunch of different ways you can categorize the ablative case, and I'll leave that for the textbook because sometimes you can get bogged down in all the details. In general, though, what it's usually doing, the simplified version, it's usually showing how something happened or how something was done. So for instance, the phrase magna voce we see a lot, which means in a loud voice. It's explaining how someone was shouting. Right? I think in one chapter we saw the word pedibus, right, with his feet, and it was when Sextus was annoying Cornelia. So you're saying, how was he annoying her? He was annoying her with his feet. So this is a very brief and generalized overview of the ablative case, but it'll help you at least kind of orient yourself when we're looking at the story. But make sure that you're going back and reading through the explanation in the textbook. Again, I would recommend not getting bogged down in the categorization they use. Sometimes in grammar, grammar textbooks, they'll break it into really, really minute details, which is fine, but in general, you don't really need to do that. If you have a more generalized view of it, you'll still be able to translate the ablative case. And once you read it enough and practice, you'll catch on what it's doing pretty much in every instance. So you should be okay. But now that we've reviewed the ablative, again, it's always good to go back and look at your noun ending chart. So we've seen this before, but this is our chart of all the noun endings, including dative, which we haven't been using, but we will in later chapters. You want to make sure that you're memorizing this chart. You don't have to necessarily sit down and memorize ending by ending. You could do that, of course, it's always beneficial. But the more you practice and see these in context and read Latin and do practice problems, that's where you're really going to memorize these. But before you do anything, you want to make sure that you understand the cases and how they're used. So now that we've done a little bit of review, we can dive into the chapter 12 story. So here's the entire story. And again, we're going to break it apart into pieces, and we're going to translate it one section at a time and highlight the different cases. So here's the first paragraph highlighted. Remember, red is for nominative, and in this case, blue is the accusative for direct objects, right? So we have Davus est solicitus, nam necesse est getam invenire. That's our first line. So Davus is anxious. And remember, he was anxious last chapter 2 because Geta ran away. So you're saying Davus is anxious or worried because, nam, it is necessary invenire, to find. There's our complementary infinitive, right? Necesse est goes with an infinitive. So it's necessary to find. Who are we looking for, or who is it necessary to find? Getam, our direct object, Geta, the slave who ran away. Then you have ubi servi effugiunt, domini saepe villicos reprehendunt. So ubi, when slaves effugiunt, run away, domini, masters, plural, right, nominative, plural, often blame or scold, reprehendunt, villicos, overseers. Remember, Davus is a slave, but he's in charge of the other slaves. We call him a villicus, an overseer. So when a slave runs away, yes, that slave will be punished, but the overseer will also be punished because they should have been watching the slaves. Then we have saepe etiam eos verberam. So here, saipe means often. So often, werberant. This is still referring to the domini, the masters. So werberare means to beat. So you're saying often they beat, or etiam, they even beat eos, them, meaning the overseers. And you'll notice how wilikos is accusative in the previous sentence. Eos is also accusative because it's the direct object, right? It's referring to the wilikos. They're both masculine, plural accusative, right? So often they beat them, meaning if they mess up, they don't just get scolded, reprehended, they also get hit, right? There's some violence involved here in how masters treat their slaves. And again, you want to remember, even though they are sort of a privileged or a slave of a higher social class, I don't know if that's the correct term, but standing in the family, I guess you could say, the wilicus is still a slave and still will be beaten, right? If they're not doing their job. And that's what it's hinting at here in this Ecce story. Then you have Cornelius est dominus bonus, sed ubi Cornelius erratus est, ... And here we have one of those lines that's kind of another odd one from Ecce Romani. Not my favorite, but what it literally says is Cornelius is a good master. And again, the implication here, I guess what they're trying to go at is that he's not one who's prone to violence, even though we have seen him be violent in previous stories, and he will be in future stories. So I'm not entirely sure what Ecce is going for here, but literally it says he's a good master, but ubi Cornelius erratus est. That means, but when Cornelius is angry, ... And they're making some odd implication that he's going to be violent and hit his slaves, which is very common. But again, it's just another bizarre line from Ecce calling him a good master, but yet he's beating everyone. So again, take it for what it is. But that's literally what the line says. Then it continues in the next paragraph. We have servus egetor davos in ariam statem convocat et rogat ubi est geta. Right? So therefore, igitur, Davos, there's our subject, he convocat, he calls together, and you have to ask, who is he calling together? Where's our direct object? It's all the way at the beginning of the sentence, the servos, the slaves. So he calls together the slaves in ariam, into the open space, right? So he tells them to come into the open space outside the house. Stata means immediately, so he immediately calls them together. And rogat, he asks, right? Ubi est geta, where is geta? That's his question. Then you have nemo respondere potest. So nobody, nemo, is able, potest, respondere, to respond, right? Nobody is able to respond, meaning they don't know where he is, right? So no one can answer. Davos egitor, alios servos, in hortum, alios in agros, alios in vineas mite. So Davos, therefore, right? Egitor means therefore. You have to go all the way to the end of the sentence to find your verb. What's he doing? He meted, he sends, right? Who does he send? Alios servos, some slaves. Where does he send some slaves? In hortum, into the garden. And you're going to see the repetition here. Alios go into the garden. Alios in agros, so some go into the fields. And alios in vineas, and some into the vineyards. So if you put it all together, you're saying Davos, therefore, sends some slaves into the garden, some into the fields, and some into the vineyards. He's trying to get the slaves to find Geta. So he's sending them to all the places where he thinks Geta might be hiding. In horto, at agris, at vineis, getam peton. So here we have prepositional phrases, and notice how they're ablative, right? So in the garden, and again, you're showing position or location here, which is why it's ablative. So in the garden and in the fields and in the vineyards, peton, they look for. Who's they? The slaves that Davos sent out, right? The slaves that he sent out are looking for getam, Geta. So you could even say they look for Geta, getam peton, in the garden, in the fields, and in the vineyards. So he sends them there, and they look for Geta there. Neque in horto, neque in focis, agrorum, neque in arboribus, venearum getam inveniunt. So here we have neque, meaning neither nor. The verb is all the way at the end. You'll notice there's no word in red here, because again, we're referring to the slaves who are looking for Geta. So if we go to the very end with inveniunt, that means they find, right? So they find getam, Geta, right? Neither in the garden nor in the ditches of the fields, in focis agrorum. Agrorum is genitive, so of the fields. And neither in arboribus, in the trees, venearum, of the vineyards. So it's showing you where they look for him, and they don't find him. That's what the neque is doing with inveniunt. So again, if you put it together, you're saying they find Geta neither in the garden, nor in the ditches of the fields, nor in the trees of the vineyards. It's just telling you where they went looking for him. They're not able to find him. So now we continue to the next paragraph. You have Davos egitor servos ubet canes in ariam ducere. So Davis, therefore, right, egetor again means therefore, you bet he orders. Who does he order? The servos. He orders the slaves. What is he ordering them to do? Ducere, to lead. Who is he ordering them to lead? The canes, the dogs, in ariam, into the open space. So this construction we've seen before, and it's a pretty straightforward one to follow. When you have verbs like you bet ordering, you're often going to see this formula of someone orders someone to do something, right? So in this case, it's Davis orders the slaves to lead the dogs. So you got to think of it that way. When you see you bet, look for the person or thing that's being ordered, right? It's probably going to be a person, in this case, servos. Then look for an infinitive to figure out what are they being ordered to do. If you put it all together again, you're saying Davis therefore orders the slaves to lead the dogs into the open space. Ali iserwi tunicam getai in ariam ferunt. So here we have Ali iserwi, some slaves, right? So some of the slaves, ferunt, they bring, right? What do they bring? The tunicam getai, the tunicam of Geta. There's the genitive showing possession. So you could also say they bring Geta's tunic, is another way to translate it, into the open space. Why are they doing this? They want the dogs to smell it so that they can go find Geta. Canes veniunt et tunicam olfaciunt. So the dogs come, canes veniunt, right? So the dogs show up, and olfaciunt, they smell. What do they smell? The tunicam, the tunic, right? So that's the idea. They get Geta's tunic, they bring it, they let the dogs smell it, and now they have the scent. Mox davos servos and agros cum canibus ducet. So soon, Davos, you have to go all the way to the end. What's he doing? Ducet, he leads. Who does he lead? The servos. He leads the slaves into the fields in agros. And again, it's accusative here because you're going into the fields. You're showing motion into. And he leads them into the fields, cum canibus, with the dogs. Cum always takes an ablative, which is why you have canibus here. So he leads them into the fields with the dogs. Latrant canes, the dogs bark, right? Per agros Cornelii, dende per agros vicinarum villarum currunt. So currunt is our verb here, and you'll notice again, there's no red word here in the sentence because the subject is implied from the last one. It's referring to the dogs. Right? So the dogs run per agros Cornelii, through the fields of the Corneliuses, right? In this case, sorry, it's not the Corneliuses, it's of Cornelius, singular, meaning the dad. So first they're going through the fields of Cornelius, then, dende, or next, through the fields of the neighboring country houses, right? Vicinarum villarum, it's genitive plural. It's saying that the dogs go looking for Geta first in the family's fields, right? The fields around the house. And then they start going into the neighboring fields, right? The fields of the neighboring country houses. Then you have neque rivi, neque foci, canes impediunt. So again, neque, meaning neither nor. Our subjects here are rivi, meaning rivers, and foci, meaning ditches. So you're saying neither rivers nor ditches impediunt, hinder, or block, or stop. Hinder is probably a good word for it. Hinder the canes, the dogs, right? So it's saying that they don't get tripped up and they don't stop just because they run into a river or a ditch. They go right through those, right? Nothing is stopping the dogs. Vestigia getai inveniunt, sed getam invenire non possunt. So vestigia are the footprints, the traces. So the footprints of Geta inveniunt they find, and vestigia here should be blue. It's a accusative, right? Just a typo by me. So inveniunt means the dogs find, right? That's what it's referring to. So they find the tracks, the footprints of Geta, vestigia getai. But said non possunt, they're not able invenire to find, right? There's our complementary infinitive. They're not able to find Geta, right? Getam. That's who they're not able to find. So it's saying they find his footprints, they just can't find him. Then you have tandem, davos eos and silvam incitat. So finally, or at last, or you could even say then, I guess finally is a good way to do it. Davos incitat, he urges on eos, them, in silvam, into the woods. Right? So again, your direct object here is eos, meaning the dogs. Okay, it's referring to the dogs. I guess technically it could be the dogs and the slaves, they're all together, but it's really the dogs who are looking for Geta. So again, you have finally Davos urges them on into the fields. Now we go to the next paragraph. We have Geta in arbore ad hoc manet et ibi dormit. So now we're talking about Geta. We're kind of changing the perspective here. So Geta ad hoc manet is still remaining or still remains in arbore, in the tree. And again, notice it's ablative because it's showing his position. He's in the tree, right? Et ibi dormit, and he sleeps, dormit, ibi, there, meaning he's sleeping in the tree. Canes latrantes eum excitant. So the barking dogs, canes latrantes, excitant, they wake him up, right? Or you could say they rouse him, eum meaning him. But the idea is he's woken up by the barking dogs. Nunc tamen geta effugere non potest, et in rami sedet, immobilis et perterritus. So now, however, nunc tamen, geta non potest effugere, he's not able to flee, right? He's up in a tree. The dogs just came into the woods. They found him. He has nowhere to go, right? So he can't leave. So he's not able to flee. And sedet, he sits, he's sitting, I guess he sits is the best way to do this. He sits in ramis, in the branches, right? Immobilis et perterritus. Immobilis, motionless, and, perterritus, frightened. So he's terrified because here come the dogs. He knows he ran away. It's a big decision because the punishment is going to be very harsh and violent if they catch him. And now he realizes that they found him. Canes ubi ad arborem apropinquant, getam ipsum non conspicuant sed olfaciunt, right? So the dogs, here's our subject, when they approach apropinquant, when they approach ad arborem, to the tree, or when they approach the tree, they don't catch sight of non conspicuant, right? They don't catch sight of Geta. Ipsum means himself, so Geta himself, but said olfaciunt, they smell him, right, is the idea. They smell Geta. So they can't see him because he's up in the tree, but they know he's there because they can smell his scent and they're following his footprints. Latrant canes, apropinquant servi. So the dogs bark, latrant canes, and the slaves approach, apropinquant servi. Miserum servum vident, qui in ramis arboris se calat. So vident, they see, meaning the slaves, they see the miserable slave, meaning Geta, who, qui, in ramis arboris se calat. Se calat means hides himself. So you're saying they see the miserable slave who is hiding himself in ramis arboris, in the branches of the tree. Descende Geta, clamet Davos. So Davos shouts, climb down Geta, right? Geta is vocative because he's calling him by name. Geta descendit, so Geta climbs down. He knows he's caught, he comes down. Davos eum tunica aripit et baculo verberat. So Davos aripit, grabs him, right? Eum aripit, literally grabs him. Eum is the direct object. Here we have the ablative that's not in a prepositional phrase by itself. And remember I told you it usually describes how you're doing something. And often we translate the ablative as by, with, from, and on. That's kind of the general way we translate it. So here you're saying he grabs him by the tunic, meaning he grabs his tunic, his shirt. And baculo verberat. Verberat, he beats him, meaning Geta, baculo, with his club, right? His baculo, his stick, his club that he carries around. Baculo and tunica are both ablative, and they're describing how these verbs were done. How did Davos grab Geta, and how did he beat him? He grabbed him by the tunic, and he beat him with his club. Dende servos ubet getam ad vilam trahere et in fronte literas fug inurere. So next, dende, he, meaning Davos, he orders the slaves, servos, trahere, to drag. Who does he order them to drag? Geta. Again, here's that construction. You order someone to do something. So when you see ubet, you're looking for an infinitive. So he orders the slaves, trahere, to drag Geta, ad vilam, to the house, and to brand, inurere, to brand in his forehead, in fronte, right, in his forehead, the letters FUG. That means fugitivus, runaway slave, which is a punishment of what would happen if you were a runaway slave. So that's the story. Again, you want to pay attention to the ablative case. That's really the big grammar that we're after. Most of it is very straightforward. At the end, we have some ablatives that aren't in prepositional phrases. Just pay attention to how we translated them so that you feel comfortable. But again, read this aloud, practice it. The more you read and practice your translation, the better off you're going to be. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the comments. I'll help you however I can. But keep at it, keep practicing. You've now seen basically all the noun endings in the cases. You want to just keep reading as much as you can to practice on your translation.